that the Trump administration is being harsh and unfair by comparing us with other developed countries and putting us, it's playing on your screen right now, you see how the trade deficit with China just keeps burgeoning, whereas the trade deficit with India is actually fairly less, and the point that the minister made was important. It's actually come down by $3 billion since President Trump got started. So the trade deficit with the United States is actually coming down, whereas your trade deficit with China is going up, and yet somehow in terms of perspective, both are being treated in the same way.
Well, we can add and subtract too, so we're well aware of the differences between the amounts of trade deficit as between the two countries. That's not a revelation in all candor. But the trade deficit with China is obviously the biggest single one. If you look at our aggregate trade deficit, there are two major components to it. One is a product line, that's called automotive. The other is geographic, that's called China. We must deal with those two components in a very decisive way if we're going to have meaningful overall reduction. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be dealing with unfair practices, even if they result in smaller trade deficits with other countries. In addition, we believe that most of the things we're requesting, particularly of India, would not only help US vis-a-vis India, we think a lot of them would help India itself. India, for example, has a wonderful opportunity right now to take advantage of trade dissension elsewhere. And when I'm meeting with Minister Goyal on a one-on-one a bit later, we've actually prepared a chart about what are the areas where China is the big exporter to us, how does that compare with what India is exporting to us, and what are possible solutions to how do we change that mixture. So I don't want you to think that we're just focusing on deficit. We're focusing also on total trade. And what the world needs is more total trade. This recent diminution in the forecast that world trade will be down to 1.2% this year is a very bad omen for the world, because normally trade, global trade, has been growing at a percentage point or so more than world GDP. So if it's really true that world trade will only grow at around 1%, that does not speak very well for world GDP. So that's a source of separate concern.
Minister Goyal, the Trump administration is complaining bitterly about unfair trade practices. India's average tariff for large economies amongst the highest in the world. And they're also complaining about how in India regulation can change midway. And this happened, for example, in e-commerce, where Amazon and Flipkart were complaining about how you came out with new e-commerce policies, even if it's the draft, and it threw their plans out of whack, saying this is not the way American companies can function. This is a good opportunity with what's happening between China and the United States for India to capitalize on, but they need certainty and continuity in policy.
First of all, I didn't find any bitterness in what Secretary Ross said. I don't know where you found the bitter complaints about unfair trade practices.
They have been talking about...
I don't think so. There are certain issues on which we can have a difference of opinion. And I think it's good to have an engagement to discuss and sort out these issues. But to my mind, India has been one of the most benign countries in terms of opening up rapidly, inviting international participation into the country. There will always be certain political imperatives which every country will have to respect and every country will have to protect. And I think in that sense, there will be issues that we will continue to engage with. Everything cannot be sorted out in 1 or 2 or 4 meetings. Trade being a complex issue will have several dimensions, particularly on e-commerce, for example. After I became Minister of Commerce, I had extensive discussions with all the e-commerce companies. And they're publicly and collectively, and the 2 or 3 main American companies individually, confirmed to me that there has been absolutely no change in the December guidelines, which have been a so-called matter of concern in the press. There's been absolutely no change in India's stand as far as e-commerce is concerned. I'm happy to share with all of you here so that there's once and for all clarity on this issue. India is very clear, considering our domestic political compulsion, that having about 120 to 130 million people dependent on small retail, which is about 50 to 60 million small retail shops through the length and breadth of the country, providing employment and working opportunities to 120 odd million people, which means effectively addressing the lives of one-third or nearly half the population of the country. Now, this small retail is a very sensitive subject. My party, which is in government today, and most of India, is very clear that we cannot let small retail die, and therefore we have restricted foreign direct investment in the multi-brand retail sector at 49%. E-commerce is expected to be an agnostic platform. It's a platform to trade in, not a platform which provides opportunities to buyers and sellers in an agnostic fashion to work together. It is not expected to become a platform either for predatory pricing. It is not expected to become a platform to use muscle power of large capital at low values being available, which allows companies to source cheap, get economies of scale in sourcing, and maybe offer discounts which in some sense throw out small retail out of business. We are very clear about it. If the law had some loopholes which was sought to be clarified in the December circular, all the companies in e-commerce have confirmed that they have understood the spirit of the law. And I once again repeat, I've repeated it on more than one occasion, Secretary Ross, please don't go to super smart Alec chartered accountants, I'm a chartered accountant also, or lawyers, I did law but never practiced, who misguide you and help you stay within the letter of the law, but very often don't help you recognize the spirit of the law. I'm again and again trying to explain to everybody that the spirit of Indian law is protecting small retail. And I think every country in the world would like to protect employment, work, and livelihoods of their people. And in that spirit, we welcome all companies, e-commerce companies to India to work as agnostic platform for people to trade in. Don't become the principal player directly or indirectly, or through structured formats which Secretary Ross and I have done all our life in the finance field. Don't try to look at structures which can fall within the ambit of the law, but in some sense break the spirit of the law. And that is a clear position of the government. It will remain so. And we've been clear about it for decades as far as the Bharatiya Janata Party is concerned. I think the e-commerce companies also have understood me loud and clear on this subject. In fact, Bharti Mittal had to break off his multi-brand retail business on this score. So and we've had this dialogue so many times. So India is very clear, we don't change rules midway. And we are clear that as regards, you mentioned something about regulations changing. In fact, I can point out instances of worldwide regulations changing more often, much more often than India. We in fact provide a very stable and predictable regulatory framework, and where we find that there are concerns, we normally try to have a dialogue. There will be an occasion or two where urgent and emergent measures are required, which every country does. The US does it very often. If there's something which is affecting US agriculture, they'll immediately put an action to protect the US agriculture. If Bangladesh has an issue, they'll certainly bring in regulation to stop that issue from becoming a bigger pain point. So I think in that spirit, we do believe everybody has policy space, but I don't think that has affected our discussions or negotiations. They are progressing very smoothly and in the same spirit of understanding.
Mr. Mittal, are the imperatives of domestic politics now at loggerheads with expectations of trade? For example, take the Modi government's efforts to ensure that all medical devices are well priced. And that's something that America is not happy about because companies supplying stents, for example, believe that this is unfair pricing. How do we reconcile the differences between what the government requires for good politics back home with what the Trump administration expects?
Well, we understand the political sensitivity of the small retail people, also of farmers and other groups. In the US, conventional retailers have been having a very, very hard time, but we have made the policy decision that it's more important to get the most efficient form of retail commerce, and ultimately that probably is some combination of e-commerce and bricks and mortar commerce. So I think it's a question of how rapidly things change. If 100 years from now, India still has as many small retailers as now, it will have held back the growth of the country immensely. So I think it's a question of proportionality, a question of timing, and a question of balancing. I think there's another factor. E-commerce tends to result in lower cost of retail product to the consumer. And in a country that has relatively low consumer income, such as India, that's the flip side. To the degree that there is a structural issue which forces Indian consumers to pay more, there's a penalty being absorbed by the whole population, not just those who are employed in retail. So we think India needs to manage, and I think will manage, the balancing act between these competing activities. But as was reported in the press yesterday, Amazon is spending 1/3 of what it spent the year before in CapEx. It probably would have spent a lot more in India if it didn't feel that there was a diminution in growth due to some of those policies. So there is also that cost to India by the policy. But at the end of the day, Indian government has to decide how they're going to balance those equations. We are making the advocacy point of view that I've just outlined. We will continue to do so. And as the diplomats say, we will have frank and mature discussions.
But Secretary Ross, if I can draw you on the point that the minister made about how predatory pricing cannot be acceptable, just because some of the companies you mentioned have billions of dollars of cash chest that they're sitting on, they're pricing products way below even the manufacturing price, and therefore it does impact Indian retail. Now, how do we overcome the very clear position the Indian government has taken and your expectations?
Well, that's what negotiations are about.
And hopefully, so let me draw Mr. Mittal in on this. How do we reconcile this, in your view, between what the Indian government needs for its domestic constituency and the expectations on the trade side?
Well, our general feeling is that negotiations are better held in the conference room than in the press room.
I think every political leadership in any country are first and foremost bound and beholden to their own people, and they have to therefore take those positions respectively. In a very rare combination or coincidence, today we have in the US President and the Commerce Secretary 2 businessmen. I mean, perhaps this has never happened before. And that's a good thing and not so great thing for some of the countries, because they can see the mistakes that have been made in the past where probably people didn't understand the trade. And I would therefore direct Secretary Ross's attention more to China, where I still remember in 2007 when some of us from CI had gone for a US trade delegation. Wherever you went, whatever you touched was made in China. And we were surprised how the US has, for a long period of time, allowed a manufacturing industry of that size and scale to develop in China at the cost of decimating the US manufacturing bases. Now, this has been going on for decades, to the benefit of China. Countries like India and all missed out because of lack of infrastructure, high cost of production. We couldn't participate in the same process. But today, when we have 2 business leaders in the leadership position of political part, their focus is certainly on China. They're taking it head on. They are making some amends. But it seems to me at the same time, there may be sort of a misdirection of some of their ire towards countries like India. Look at India. Facebook, Google, WhatsApp, Instagram, Snapchat, these are large US companies today. each one of them are dominant in India. China, they're not even allowed to enter in. So very large amounts of economic value to these companies, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap of these companies, rest on the people of India. I hope in your business calculation, you will take note of that. And when you fight for those stents or Harley-Davidson duties or those small other issues, they are much too immaterial for the larger partnership that today India and US can enjoy between themselves. As Prime Minister said, the oldest and the largest democracies certainly deserve a much stronger strategic partnership. And I would urge, when you are here talking to the Indian political leadership, keep in mind this is one country which has opened up absolutely and freely for foreign investments in almost every sector. Duties are mainly in line with the WTO-bound duties. It's a place where we welcome all foreign investment. And perhaps at times I feel we may have, in the last 15, 20 years as chambers, as business people, pushed our governments much too much to open up too fast without having reciprocity of taking some benefits back from the other side. In closing, I would also say many of us are invested in the US, there's many in the audience as well. We have generally a very warm welcome in the US for our businesses. People are enjoying the business activity. Your nation is rising dramatically. Duties are in a good shape. Taxes are in good shape. But you are also the world power, and you have some duties and obligations towards building those strategic alliances with countries like India, Bangladesh, and many others. And we are nowhere close to being a developed nation. We are certainly an emerging market and a developing nation. I think we need a little bit more indulgence and understanding from your side.
I agree with quite a few of the points that you just made. Our president has made it very clear that we don't blame China for the imbalance altogether. A lot of it, maybe most of it, is due to incorrect policies by prior American administrations. But the fact is we are where we are, and those policies are no longer our policies, number one. Number two, our issues with China are not just day-to-day trade. We have some very serious structural issues with them relating to forced technology transfer, relating to respect for intellectual property, relating to subsidy of state-owned enterprise, a whole panoply. If we just were focused on trade, we could have had a deal 2.5 years ago. So it's a misconception to say that the issues are the same. They're not the same. There's a very big, complicated thing that requires structural reform in China if we're to get to a reasonable balance. The other thing, sure, there is a trade-off, but Amazon and the other e-commerce companies didn't get to be the world's biggest by any evil mechanism. They got there because they are extremely efficient, they're extremely effective at what they do, and the question is, for a country like India, how do you balance those economic benefits for your population as a whole versus the, let's say, special interest of the retail segment or of domestic competitors? That's the balancing act that our discussions hopefully will help to fine-tune.
Dr. Haq, Bangladesh has been looking to leverage the rising trade tensions between China and the United States by especially getting a lot of the apparel manufacturers to come. In fact, Bangladesh has become a source of envy in India. Your growth rate currently more than ours, and even your ability to attract investment when it comes to apparel and manufacturing. So what's Bangladesh's secret sauce, and how do you see the conversation that we've had so far?
Well, Bangladesh is actually a development miracle. We're a development surprise for the rest of the world. With an unbeaten 8.2% GDP growth, we are growing. And we're not even the size of, or almost the size of Wisconsin, with 165 million people down there, with many, many existential challenges. I think the policy reforms and what's happening in Bangladesh should be an example for the rest of the world. And we've been largely overlooked. And let me take the advantage of just saying that we've been growing with America. And lately, the US-China trade war perception has, of course, played an important part. But what we have mostly overlooked is the latest 587 tariff lines that the US imposed extra 10% on the 1st of September, $25 million it involves. And out of that, 12 million is from China, and the rest is from Bangladesh, only 4 million, Vietnam, a little more, India, even less. So the country which has mostly benefited is actually Vietnam. So Vietnam almost has benefited to up to 16.82%. So Bangladesh, yes, is hoping that the business is really, really going to grow, but so far it has happened up to a certain level. It's not galloping. It's just about, I wouldn't say flat, but it's not up to the expectations. And China, America imports, the top 30 products that China exports to the US, Bangladesh has an overlap of around 16 products. And in those 16 products, we're actually dipping. But again, Vietnam is increasing. So there must be some magic in Vietnam. And also, we don't have GSP from America. And unfortunately, so I think the trade narrative also evolves a lot around the labor narrative. So every time we try telling America that we're really good and we can do everything and we are the most sustainable and the most compliant hub, manufacturing hub of the world, I think we sort of go back to the same question of, well, how is labor rights doing in Bangladesh? And there doesn't seem to be a substantial shift there, whereas we have actually done quite a lot. So we're hoping that someday, pretty soon, we'll be favorably looked upon, as we so deserve, and we hope that we will see the light. And, talking about India and Bangladesh at the same time, I think India, a fresh set of incentives just got declared. So Indian manufacturers are going to get 4% extra export incentive, and that's going to probably push the growth from India as well. At this point, I would just like to say that Bangladesh and India can grow together. It need not be a competition. It could be co-opetition. It could be collaborative competition. And if we have inter-regional trade connectivity and support, I think we would even grow faster. So maybe we can just join hands and appeal to the US to of course, consider us as very, very collaborative and very competitive partners.
As our neighbor in the East, all of us are actually delighted to see the way Bangladesh has been able to grow and the speed at which you're growing. And it wasn't so the case till recently, but there is growing envy as well. So, kudos to everyone in the manufacturing sector in Bangladesh and to the people in government. Mr. Kirloskar, President Trump is pushing American companies to shift manufacturing outside China. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for a fundamental recasting of global supply chains. But a lot of this is going to countries like Vietnam, countries like Bangladesh. Is there a concern that India could miss out once again? What more would you like to see the Indian government do?
Let me take the example of the automotive industry, which is roughly 50% of the manufacturing in India, and I know it the best. Luckily, I think over the last 20 years, we've become part of a global value and supply chain. And to a large extent, a lot of our automotive components, which are being exported, even cars which are being exported, are fairly competitive now. I think we are ready to increase capacities more. You need the domestic market to increase as well as export. For us, regional cooperation is also very, very important in the automotive industry to be part of this global supply chain. An example is one of our products sold all over the world, but components are made in various countries in Southeast Asia, and it has been very, very successful, this kind of trade cooperation. The only sort of thing I need to look at is we still don't have very large economies of scale like in the developed countries. So when we do these trade agreements, we need some sunset clause. It need not be very long, but it needs some sunset clause, not in all industries, but in some industries. That's the main issue. if I look at ex-factory costs, I see it again, in the manufacturing area. Our ex-factory costs compared to most of Southeast Asia is about, we've seen our own examples, 0.7, 0.8 compared to Southeast Asia. We are losing out from ex-factory to the port in many areas. And that's where we need to focus a lot in the cost to get ourselves competitive on a global basis. But Indian industry is ready to take the challenge on being competitive. We are all focused on competition here, and we'd like to continue to be focused on competition, not just look for government SOPs.
Secretary Ross, I want to quote to you what Ashley Tellis, who's a very respected figure in DC and the senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He said recently in a post, and I want to quote that to you, the Trump administration, he says, has a schizophrenic approach to relations with India. It wants to work with India on the strategic dimensions as President Bush and Obama did, but on the other hand, it treats India as a trade competitor. Previous administrations found a way to balance their strategic interests with India vis-a-vis their economic interests. What the Trump administration wants are the benefits of the strategic relationship while continuing to treat India as an economic problem.
Well, I think we've shown that we regard India as a very important global partner. We upgraded India's status in terms of defense, so they now have much less fettered access to American defense products. And we believe we make the best military equipment in the whole world. So that's a big thing and was a very deliberate thing, because there's nothing more sensitive than sharing your most advanced military equipment with another country. So I think that's very much proof that we have a very great respect for India as a geopolitical partner as well as a trading partner. I do think, though, people have mentioned Vietnam a bit. Vietnam is a very good example of a country that has picked out a couple of specific segments and built very big scale. Electronics, they got Korean companies to invest there. They built up their scale, they built up their expertise. They are now an extremely competitive place with anyone. Footwear, same thing. They've done a very, very good job. And that's what I meant before when I said I think part of the thing that developing countries should do is figure out which are the particular segments where you can do the best, figure out what are the impediments that you have now. In case of India, it was mentioned logistics. Logistics are a problem here. And one of the things that China did much more rapidly than India is dealing with transportation infrastructure. Logistics are a problem in India. They are a handicap. Then I think if you could solve the logistics and solve the scale issues, India could be very, very much more competitive. So, and those are things that don't hurt U.S., don't hurt anything, but those are the kinds of suggestions that we're trying to make to India as part of our discussion.
But Secretary Ross, you mentioned defense, and you say that America is offering high-end technology. America simultaneously is threatening sanctions against India for purchasing the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. And our foreign minister said very recently that it's India's sovereign right to purchase weapon systems from whichever country we want. And the Trump administration is threatening CAATSA sanctions the moment we make our first tranche of payment to Russia for the S-400.
Well, India has a historical connection to Russia. We understand that. But there are issues of compatibility as between Russian equipment and U.S. equipment. We're going through it now with some of the NATO countries. That's a complicated issue, but it's an issue that needs to get sorted out, both from the American point of view and from the Indian point of view. There needs to be a more rational approach to it.
Minister Goyal, you mentioned very emphatically that there is policy continuity and regulations don't change. And the moment you said it, Secretary Ross said, look at Amazon's investment figures for India for this year. It's 1/3 of what they invested in years gone by. And if there was actual policy continuity and regulations didn't change, Amazon and other American companies would be investing that much more because policy changes midway. It sends a negative impact to other countries who are looking at the India story.
First of all, I reiterate there was no policy change midway, since you seem to be still living in that old
No, I'm quoting
issue.
back what Secretary Ross.
But as far as Amazon's investment is concerned, it could be several factors. I mean, they may have over-invested in the previous year. I don't know. I don't run their business. So it's up to Amazon what they decide to invest, what they don't decide to invest, where they see their market going. Maybe now they recognize that they can't do some of the things that they possibly were doing earlier in the spirit of the law that I have articulated very categorically. And though, of course, this investment figure is of last year before I came in. But I think the important thing that may also be looked at by the larger group here and thought through is the fact that while there may be certain advantages of large retail coming in and bringing down costs, bringing economies of scale, one will also, and maybe to some extent also a benefit to some consumers. But one will have to also recognize the fact that if the consumer and a large part of the Indian consumption base is dependent on a livelihood from that small retail, if they don't have money in their pocket and they don't have any work, there won't be anything to spend in any case as consumers. So we'll have to ensure that those consumers continue to have a basic income level, they continue to have work opportunities, they continue to have income to spend before trying to reduce their spending. And I think with India at one of the lowest inflation rates that we've seen in the 72-year independent India's history, our inflation in the last 5 years has been the lowest ever since 1947. And we've come down from the era of double-digit inflation and huge spikes and ebbs in inflation to an era where inflation, in fact, has never crossed 4% in the last 5 years. More often than not, it's been 2%, 2.5%, at times under 2%. And I think it's an era where we are seeing stability in prices. This has been one election, Secretary Ross, in 2019, where 3 words, which used to be a permanent feature of India's elections, did not have any traction in the election campaign. One is corruption, second is inflation, and the third is secularism. These are 3 words which used to be the hallmark of every election in India. This election was an election that Prime Minister Modi fought on the back of a corruption-free administration and huge steps taken to rid this country of this tag of a dishonest nation. We are moving towards making India the most honest nation to do business in. Second, we are looking to a more inclusive and a more united polity. So secularism was not an issue in this election. All communities have lived in peace. We've had the least amount of communal disturbances in the last 5 years. And lastly, in terms of inflation, in Hindi there's a phrase for those who understand Hindi, and then I'll translate it. Ke महंगाई कमर तोड़ महंगाई. So it used to be a back-breaking inflation, which used to be a regular feature of India and Indian elections. That inflation and back-breaking inflation is killing our income levels, is killing our ability to spend and have a decent quality of life. Given the last 5 years' track record, and I had mentioned this in another context, that Prime Minister Modi has broken the back of back-breaking inflation. A few months ago, this is a comment that I had made, that actually 5 years have been spent in ensuring that the country doesn't have to suffer from huge amounts of stress due to price inflation. So we have a situation where the country is growing in an organized manner. We have to take care of every section of society, and until alternate work opportunities come up for these small retailers, it'll have to be a balanced and calibrated movement towards engaging more with technology, allowing e-commerce to do some of the things they can possibly do in the Western developed world. For them to be able to do that in India, a more calibrated glide path will have to be built up. Working opportunities for that large section of population in alternate occupations, alternate income earning work will have to be created. And that's the work, that's the roadmap on which we are working.
Mr. Mittal, the United States government is pressing India hard not to take 5G technology from China, from Huawei, That's one of the big thrust areas. As a key player in this segment, and also from the perspective of India, do you believe that's an unfair bargain? Because the costs at which Huawei can sell to India are much cheaper than what we'd be buying from European or American companies. So how do you view America's very stern pressure on this?
Well, first of all, our concerns about Huawei have nothing to do with advancing the cause of American telecom equipment people. We do not have a direct competitor to Huawei. So the notion that our views on Huawei are a function of U.S. protectionism are simply incorrect. There is no U.S. competitor. The big competitors are people like Ericsson and Nokia, not U.S. Now, there may well evolve some sort of U.S.-European consortium, but anybody who thinks we're doing this out of protectionism simply does not know the facts. The reason we're doing it, we think there are genuine security issues. And 5G is very different from 3G and 4G. 3G, 4G, you are able to separate peripheral parts from the central part. 5G, that is not possible. In 5G, if there's a penetration, if there is in fact a back door, it's going to infiltrate the whole system. So the proportionality of risk, we think, is very considerable. Second thing we think, Huawei is, after all, very dependent on U.S. technology. So it isn't that there's some magical thing that Huawei has found that is not available elsewhere in the world. I believe that within a few years, there will be a Western alternative that leapfrogs in technology Huawei. Well, since 5G is such a revolutionary thing and is going to take quite a while to roll out anyway, our feeling is, why jump into it? In most technology things, the first version of a product is not as good as the second and third and fourth version. So while we agree that 5G is important, we do think there's a genuine security risk. And it isn't just a risk on the front end. There are constant upgrades, there are constant maintenance things. Every time there's an interaction with the vendor, there's the potential for a security issue to develop. So our concern is based on our desire to hope that our geopolitical partner, India, does not inadvertently subject itself to untoward security risks. That's the nature of our concern. At the end of the day, obviously, India has to make its own decision. But our concerns are security, not protectionism.
Mr. Mittal, how real are these security concerns in your view?
Well, I think Secretary Ross has rightly pointed out, it's an advisory from the US. Of course, they'll decide for America, and I think they've already banned the use of Huawei in at least the government projects, possibly all. And in any case, for decades, US networks have not been buying Chinese equipment, whether it's ZTE or Huawei. They are relying mostly on Nokia and Ericsson. And now Samsung is coming into that space as well. Advisory is, I think, well taken from our point of view. I've tracked this industry for now 25 years. And I'm not going into whether IP was compromised. Huawei, over the last 10 or 12 years, has become extremely good with their product, to a point where I can safely say today their products, at least in 3G, 4G that we've experienced, is significantly superior to Ericsson and Nokia, without a doubt, and I use all three of them. They have actually surprised me on how fast they've been able to take the technology curve to a level where it's leading edge. The power consumption is a fraction of the Europeans. The footprint is very small if you have to put it on a tower. And they're very powerful leading features where you can split, slice, dice the spectrum and use it in a variety of ways. They're clearly leading edge. Now, whether they compromise some American IPs, I don't know. And the second part is China will, in 24 to 36 months, become 100% free from any American component. That they've taken upon themselves as their mission for the country, that in all these high-tech equipment, they will not have any chipsets, components, active or passive, coming in from the US, because they know the leverage the US has on them is extreme. India will have to decide for themselves their relationship with China on a larger context. And India and China are big trade partners, they are neighbors, they have a huge population to serve. And all I would say is India will take this advice carefully, but the decision will have to be taken politically by
What's
India.
your view? Which side should we lean?
My view is they should be in play. I really feel they should be in play. India must use this as a leverage. There are lots of open issues with China as well, and India must take full advantage of that, unlike opening it to many other Western companies, our country, and then having very little leverage. I would rather have this leverage today because it's an important part. The benefit of American pushback has been that Huawei has now opened up its technology. They are offering it to an American company to take it over and develop on it based on a fee. I'm sure they'll do the same for an Indian company. If a TCS or a Wipro or anybody else would like to manufacture those equipment here, they'll gladly open it up. So one thing that they've done is opened up the Chinese technology for accessing by...
Minister, is that a solution? The management of Huawei now offering a full transfer of technology. They've offered it to the US. Mittal says push hard enough, they'd give it to you as well, given the scale of your market.
Well, I think I should leave that to the concerned minister. Ravi Shankar Prasad and his team are very competent and capable. Let them handle this issue. I have enough on my plate.
As we come, Secretary Ross, to the conclusion of this conversation, there's something that, I've always wondered. Are you also a big Harley-Davidson fan? What is this obsession the Trump administration has with tariffs on Harley-Davidsons, given the fact that Indian consumers are barely buying like 1,000 Harleys at all? Did you ride a lot of Harleys? Why is it so big and why is it so important?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. That sounded a little more like a statement.
President Trump has, on multiple occasions, pushed the Indian Prime Minister to reduce tariffs on the imports of Harley-Davidson motorcycles, the superbikes. And India reduced tariff from 100% to 50%, and that's not enough. It happened with one phone call, the American president said. So I'm saying, why is that one particular kind of motorcycle such an important part of the narrative when it comes to India-US trade?
Well, I don't think we treat India at all unfairly relative to anyone else. It's not right to say President's doing this, that, or the other thing relative to India. President has gone out of its way to have a very good relationship with Prime Minister Modi. The whole Howdy Modi event is unprecedented in the entire history of the U.S. Never has the U.S. sitting president had such a big public event with a foreign leader from any country, period. So if there's any doubt, that was a very conscious and overt act to send a very clear message both to the Indian American community and most importantly to the Indian community. This is a qualitatively different relationship from that which has previously existed between the United States and India, and all of our discussions are conducted within that frame of reference. So let's have that be very, very clear.
Mr. Goel, as we conclude, how long will it be before we have first limited trade deal and then, in your view, a larger trade deal? Are we heading towards a free?
You seem to be knowing more about it than me.
I'm asking you.
Maybe you can set up a date. But I think these type of discussions, we should allow the negotiating teams to work on. Wherever they have any issues, Secretary Ross, USTR, Bob, me, all of us, we sit down in a very comfortable and very, very open-minded way. We are able to resolve these issues. So it's more a question of scheduling times and scheduling calls and meetings that will determine how long that will take. But I don't see any big issue that's holding it back for any reason. And I don't think that just this announcement is holding back Indian trade or Indian relations, either geopolitical, either at the leaders level, or even our trade and business or services level. I don't think nothing is significantly impacted right now, but we want to actually take a quantum leap in that, which is the direction in which both the countries and our negotiating teams and leadership is working.
Mr. Kirloskar, Dr. Haq, Sunil Bharti Mittal, Secretary Ross, and Minister Piyush Goyal for joining us at the India Economic Summit. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. Thank you.